This is going to be a discussion about my forthcoming book. Well, it's out actually in the UK and will be out in the US in January. It's called Twitter, Social Communication in the Twitter Age. My name is Dhiraj Murthy, and I'm a professor at Bowdoin College in sociology. And here with me is Brian Purnell, a professor of Africana Studies. And I don't know if you can introduce yourself, Brian, because you can do better than I can do.
I'm Brian Purnell. I teach in the Africana Studies program. I'm an assistant professor of Africana Studies, and my main area of scholarship is in social history and social movement history. So for me, this was a lot of fun to read a sociological analysis of something contemporary, but something that also has historical connections, and for my own interests, a connection to activism and social movements. So this was a lot of fun for me to read, and I'm looking forward to asking you some of the questions I have. But the first ones are really about the genesis of the book and kind of how it fits into sociology. So why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, the book has come from a long-standing discussion I've had myself with the theories and canons of sociology. My background in sociology is theoretical and empirical, as the book reflects. And in a lot of ways, I've tried to take the time to think about long-standing philosophical and sociological debates about events, the formation of culture, going back to the Frankfurt School and the creation of popular culture, and what roles capitalism plays in the propagation of media culture. I'm also have been interested in big discourses around influence. How do we build influence in society? What role do celebrities play in celebrity culture? And sociology has touched on all these areas. But what I saw when I started becoming interested in social media is that a lot of the sociological work, which is already minimal, but a lot of the work on Twitter generally and social media generally is very empirical. So what I wanted to do is take a step backwards and look at Twitter and social media more broadly from a historical vantage point, and also theoretically, but also bring in empirical work. So try to be more synthetic in terms of my approach to social media rather than just trying to hit one area. And I think that's really the genesis of the book, is trying to not just do empirical work, not just do theoretical work, and not just do historical work, but try to bring the three things together.
Yeah. So some initial responses to Twitter, from some popular responses and perhaps even some scholarly responses, is that there's an anxiety over a reduction in human interaction.
Right.
Or at least there's an anxiety or a criticism that Twitter reduces face-to-face interaction. And I think that your book really addresses this anxiety. So related to both the empirical and the theoretical analysis that you bring, why do you think that criticism of Twitter, that Twitter somehow reduces a more legitimate form of human interaction, why does that criticism exist?
Well, I think it's not exclusive to Twitter. It's sort of every time we have an epochal shift in communications, this discourse, this debate seems to crop up, and my research has sort of shown that with, if you look back in science studies, science and technology studies, the reception of the telephone, even going farther back to the telegraph, telegrams, all these technologies which now we don't think are revolutionary, but obviously in their time they were. And all of those, if you think about letter writing actually, and the advent of the postal system and the fact that ships were taking letters around the world, people actually, their discussions at the time, you read fascinating newspaper articles and public debates on letter writing. People say letter writing is the death of cafe culture, right? And people wouldn't go to French cafes, and Parisian society would die because of the fact that letters would percolate in this way. And people were calling for letters to just still go by transport of horse and carriage, right? So and that would take a long time. And in the interim, you would have thoughtful discussions. Obviously, we've seen over time, and now we think letter writing is a phenomenally indulgent, academic and otherwise, literary pursuit. And it's a kind of interesting thing, because I think perhaps Twitter is going to be that at some time, and we'll reflect back and go, oh yeah, Twitter, that was a thoughtful, analytical method.
So, again, tell me if my theory is totally off, but is this an example of kind of Marx's dictum, everything that's solid melts into thin air? Is this just kind of a characteristic of modern life, that new phenomena occur and there's anxiety and eventually the new very much looks like the old?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's exactly where I was coming from. And to sort of keep drawing from Marx, tweets obviously are not going to ossify. We're not going to get any hardness out of them. But same with a lot of other communication. But the interesting thing is, and I'll take that back to some extent, is we've seen when letter writing was eclipsed, and telephone calls are eclipsed, and telegrams are eclipsed, and the telegraph is eclipsed, all those historical forms of communication generally don't fully disappear. Obviously, the telegraph has, but telegrams haven't. They're still used for very special events. The Queen sends telegrams out. And these sort of things actually show an ossification, then, in some ways, a privileging of older forms of communication. But in the frame of Marx, yeah, I think it's capitalism and obviously hyper-globalization that's moving very quickly, and all of this is going to melt away. It is, and that's part of what the tweets are, in a way. They just sort of appear and they disappear, appear, disappear, and most of the stuff on Twitter is doing that. There's very little that does have the time to ossify into something solid.
So this is a very good segue into the sections of your book that have to do with putting Twitter in a historical context of kind of modern communication. How is Twitter significantly different, is Twitter significantly different from other forms of communication in media? And in your book, you do talk about the telegraph. There's some really interesting sections in there about radio, television, email, or even other forms of social media. What's different and what's similar between Twitter and these other modern forms of staying in touch?
Absolutely. Obviously, there's differences in contemporary social media versus old technologies. Though there's a lot of throwbacks and similarities, there's a phenomenal amount of difference as well. I think contemporary social media would not be what it is without its historical antecedents, and I think we do have to contextualize those things. There's something about contemporary social media, and Twitter in specific, that's built on those things. I mean, even if you think of Twitter and text messages and SMS, I mean, it's a fairly old technology now. If we think back to when text messaging first became popular, in the 90s and 2000s, that's a long time ago, but not really historically. But what Twitter has done versus, let's say, just with text messages as the first bridge, and we can seg farther back, is it's converted them from something that was private, right, 140 characters, that was private, person to person, to being public. And that's huge. That's a really big difference. In terms of the fact that we're making what were once private discourses hyper-public. And it goes beyond to also be something into what's been discussed in sociology as a networked public. So the idea that people are networked in these public spheres. So it's not just going into a big ether where we're all just shouting out stuff, but actually there's built networks that connect that communication. Whereas with text messages, that existed just point to point. You could do group text messages, and you had party lines with telephones where everyone would call in, and you could listen to everyone chatter.
Right.
But that was also highly synchronous. Twitter can be somewhat asynchronous in that you have these tweets floating around, and you pick up a tweet three hours later, or even a day or 2 days later, most likely not days later. But there doesn't have to be the synchronicity of a telephone party line or a group text message. And I think there's these differences in the fact over time that Twitter has taken advantage of this multiplexity of communication and the fact that we are multicasting. We're not just broadcasting, but we're constantly doing many-to-many communication, which is a huge build from, if you throw back to the radio, which is broadcast singularly, TV, which is broadcast singularly. You have the advent of radio call-in shows, TV, interactions, but social media has taken that to a totally different dimension in terms of participatory culture and many-to-many communication.
So, let's step back a bit and we could go back to your analysis of Twitter. In your introduction, you asked the question, what is the significance of this turn to terseness, right? And I think that there's a lot of the anxiety that people have about Twitter has to do with the succinct nature of the communication. You write about the anxiety or the criticism that it dumbs down human communication. It represents a victory for short attention spans, or even that Twitter could be somehow connected to a popularity of egocentric culture. That's a lot of the criticism. But the analysis that you just provided is that there's something else socially at work within this medium of a turn to terseness. So, are the criticisms of Twitter wrong? I mean, does this fixation with the brevity and the quickness and the immediacy, does it miss a lot of these other multi-point to multi-point communication social networks that you're talking about?
Well, I think reductivism is always tempting, and it's clean. It's an easy way to criticize a technology, right? And we've always seen that. I mean, if you take a look at reductivist criticism of smartphones, it was the same exact thing, right? That here are these devices that are going to take over our lives. There's some truth to that. I mean, people are constantly checking their Blackberries and iPhones, so there is some truth to that. So similarly, I'd say there's some truth to the criticisms that you've just mentioned, right? I think I don't want to dismiss all of them. At the same point, that reductivism is at the expense of some of the richness that's operating in social media. I think all social communication is reflective of our social engagement in life, right? Our social interactions. And if we just brush it aside and say, it's terse, then we're kind of missing the fact that all throughout human history, we've had terse communication, right? If you think there's a fire in a building and someone yells out fire really loudly, you don't have to say, there is a lot of heat, smoke, noxious gas in this room, perhaps we should exit. Right. You just yell fire. Right. And so all throughout human history, we've always been able to, and this draws from Erving Goffman, sociologist who's well known for studying linguistic interactions and how we present ourselves. And one of Goffman's arguments is we have these forms of truncated speech, right, that are terse speech, that have always existed in human communication that satisfy the questioning, right? So it's enough to say what's going on. And if someone is asking for, similar to fire, if someone's asking for directions, you could say, actually, that building's over there. You don't have to go into long explanation. And sometimes tweets can do just that, right? So Twitter, a lot of times, is not dumbed down in a sense, but actually intentionally terse, because you can satisfy what you're trying to get across. And other times it falls short, and that's where the critics are right. I mean, when I discuss towards the latter part of the book about health, and people saying, I just got diagnosed with cancer, you would think 140 characters isn't enough to do that. So it's a kind of interesting thing, but the person tweeting that thinks it is. So to be reductivist and just label it and say it's not enough kind of doesn't take into account the actual participants too, and they may be happy and satisfied with terse speech.
So this is another really good aspect of the book, your discussion about how Twitter democratizes a whole range of practices and forms of communication and methods of producing information. So I want to ask you some questions about that.
Sure.
One powerful idea in the book and one powerful reality with Twitter is that consumers of information, not necessarily producers, can determine what information is important and what information is worth their attention. This is parts of your book where you talk really I thought in an exciting way about the democratization of Twitter. So can you explain a bit how that works? How does Twitter, in a sense, turn on its head who controls what information goes out there and what information is important?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had the pleasure this semester of actually teaching a social media course where this was one of the core thematics, actually, of, is Twitter democratizing or not? And it was very interesting, and I'll talk about what I talked about in my book, but it was also very interesting hearing what students had to say about this debate, because they're obviously very interested in it. And one of the examples that's not so much discussed in my book, but came out during class discussions, is that of Kony 2012, and I don't know if you're familiar with Joseph Kony, and Invisible Children, which is obviously gained a lot of media attention, and Oprah was involved, and P. Diddy, and lots of other celebrities. And one of the questions I asked, and I do ask this in the book as well, is there's this fascinating current in Twitter of people that are able to grow movements, activist spaces, protest against things, whether they're companies, and you've seen, especially with companies, there's been a lot of success in Twitter of grassroots groups organizing and saying, we're going to boycott this product, or this company needs to change their practice. Mm-hmm. They combine that with a YouTube video and some other social media. They can be highly successful. But at the same time, one of the interesting currents that emerges, and I've tried in the book to give a balanced perspective of things, is also that there are people who have a tremendous amount of influence and have. This is the historical pattern. And Twitter also facilitates the ability of people who have existent power or can tap into networks of social capital and cultural capital to leverage existing media industries. So to go back to Kony 2012, I mean, you have people involved in the production of the video and all the Twitter activity who came from film school, who knew how to create a completely glossy aesthetic that was able to draw us in as an audience. Then also using their cultural and social capital, get tweets out to Oprah, get tweets out to P. Diddy, get tweets out to all these celebrities. And then they created this huge influence. That's not tremendously revolutionary. So Twitter is very interesting in the fact that it propagates old styles of influence that are celebrity-driven or influence-driven. If Barack Obama tweets something, it's going to be picked up, or Oprah Winfrey tweets what she had for breakfast, it's going to be retweeted, right? But if a normal person says those same banal things, it doesn't have that propagation. So it's both revolutionary in its democratization of activism, but also propping up old structures. But the fascinating thing is it's doing both. So in the one hand, it is democratizing because it's giving a microphone to pockets who otherwise wouldn't have engagement. One of the most fascinating things also is the fact that a celebrity or influence maker may pick up something that is of interest, right? And that's what happened with Kony 2012, but also may pick up something that's far smaller, that's more organic, and then that explodes too. I don't know if that's democratizing per se, but it's definitely giving a voice to some activists who would not have the ear of someone famous. And that's a kind of interesting current as well.
Or wouldn't have the access to a particular medium
that's free, that's efficient, that's global.
Let's I do have some questions that I think this helps segue into about you write about the digital divide and Twitter. How does the way that Twitter disseminates information, or how does the way that Twitter works socially, how does it reflect the digital divides that exist through class and economics, digital divides that may even exist on a global scale regionally?
And I think that's one of, going back to the genesis of the book, one thing I have found lacking in the literature on social media is not enough attention paid to digital divides. We all tend to start with this assumption that's very bourgeois, that comes from our existence as privileged people, that we automatically have a certain buy-in of technology, right? To have an iPhone is not a big deal, right? To have a MacBook Pro is not a big deal, right? We start out with these premises in terms of where we're coming in. And one of my problems in talking to people when I was doing the research for the book is that's just a bad problem. Sociologically, that's just wrong. We can't go through and be reductivist in terms of what technological base point we're at. There's a ton of literature that's been done for decades around internet use, computer technologies, going back to floppy disks and all of that. You know, where do we become stratified? And those digital divides are still very much alive. There's been interesting work that debunks the idea that all youth are technologically savvy. That actually you get kids from very underprivileged backgrounds that have not had access to this technology in school, at home, etc. So I think one of my things in looking at Twitter and the digital divide is we've got a lot of problems, that not just even in terms of access. Let's say someone then gets an Android phone or something. Well, they may not know how to use it. They may not know how to tweet. They may not see the purpose of it. They may not know how it can network them. They may have language barriers, right? Let's say they're a Spanish speaker and most of the tweets circulating in the Twitterverse are English, right? There's a growing Hispanic, for example, community on Twitter, which is very fascinating. But it's also not easy on your phone to tweet in Spanish. If you try, right, all the default modes, if you buy a phone in Anglophile countries, are set to English language. So when you even start tweeting in Spanish, it auto-corrects you to English. And those are easy on a certain sense to change, but not easy if you don't have the cultural capital in terms of technology. So I think we've got huge masses of people who aren't getting connected by Twitter, and there's huge masses of people that are. And one of the interesting things, and again going back to that balanced perspective, is on the flip side, you have people in countries like India and a lot of African countries who are getting these phones or are getting access to computers and are participating in Twitter too. So it's this, the digital divide is not, we can't be reductionist on it as well. And we can't just say, actually, if people come from underprivileged backgrounds, they cannot use Twitter. But we have to be careful in terms of how we examine Twitter and digital divides. And there's some interesting disjunctures, and there's some interesting continuities from times past. And I have found that very interesting. And one of the things, just to add to that, is a lot of people forget that actually if you come from a marginalized background and you're trying to consume this information on Twitter and you don't have certain levels of cultural capital, you can also be more susceptible to misinformation. That's another thing I've tried to really pay heed to in the book, is that there's a lot of things that propagate through Twitter that are false and can actually cause a lot of damage to vulnerable groups.
Yeah, you know, I want to come back to this when we talk about your chapter on Twitter and disasters. Again, a fascinating argument that you have in the section on sociological theory and method is that technology cannot be divorced from what is social or the society. Can you talk a little bit about that argument?
Yeah, and a lot of that argument goes back to a lot of German philosophy that I've included in that chapter. So I made reference to Heidegger, for example, and Heidegger's a German philosopher who's done a lot of work on being, existential philosophy, did a lot of work on Nietzsche as well, but he took a lot of time to comment on technology. And one of his big arguments is technology is socially embedded. I mean, it sounds a bit trite from our perspective in a lot of ways, but we often forget that. And one of the things I was trying to bring through with including Heidegger in that chapter is the fact that we need to look at the social embeddedness of technology, and that actually technology is quite revelatory of a lot of social structures, right? It's not to say that technology is good or bad in a sense, but that we have to look at it as a social entity. So in answering your question, I think when we look at social media, rather than being, and a lot of this goes back to that reductionist argument, but rather than being reductionist and saying, oh, this technology, it's forcing us to constantly pull out our phones and tweet. Another argument that one needs to make is how is the technology and the formation of technology as a capitalistic industry reflective of our social wants, desires, and needs. There's something in us, in our social organization, that has also propelled tech companies to push in their ways, rather than just saying tech companies made these glossy devices that are small and force us to tweet, right? And I think there's an interesting dialectic, to go back to Marx, and there's a dialectical tension that emerges in terms of that, which I've tried to navigate in the book. Is it technology that's making us tweet, or is it our changes in social formation that's forcing the technological change?
You know, Twitter, you say that Twitter can, this is related to what the technology does and what it doesn't do. And I liked the metaphor, the image that you use of the megaphone. Right. And you write that Twitter...
Should brought one in.
Twitter can be thought of as a megaphone that makes public the voices or conversations of any individual or entity. Conversational exchanges on Twitter become transformed by the medium rather than merely amplified. That Twitter isn't just a method of communication that puts an idea out there, right? But it's a method of communication that has a transformative relationship with the information. So could you explain that a little bit? How is Twitter more than a megaphone, and how does it transform conversations and human discourse?
Yeah, no, it kind of goes back to when you were asking about is it a problem that it's terse, right? And it kind of that's a good starting point to enter into that discussion, in the sense of if you label tweets simply as these 140 character messages, in a way you're missing the larger picture of how Twitter is constituting social communication itself, right? So one of the ways in which 140 characters actually has spawned its popularity is because it's short. You've got this concise information. So you're not trying to take this megaphone to a long droning speech that you're trying to blast at. Rather, you've got this condensed nugget that sometimes people have crafted, right? Sometimes people are very off the cuff with tweets. Sometimes people take a lot of time to craft, especially an activist tweet, that they're trying to get people's attention. And the big difference between it just being merely a microphone where you're shouting out something and you're hoping people across campus or in a city hear you, it's connecting that to the networked public aspect I was talking about. Mm-hmm. So if you've got this interesting tweet and other people think it's interesting, right? So you've initially done your megaphone, you blast it out. Someone else then takes it and then retweets it, which is the forwarding of it. And then another megaphone goes, right? Then it goes to someone, another megaphone, and it keeps chaining, but then it trees off, right? So it's not just that one person goes and it's one linear chain, but rather it's, to borrow from math, like a series of vectors. So you have all these open lines that are basically coming through arrays of chains that then keep fanning out, which makes Twitter very different. It makes it exponential in terms of your potential reach, which goes back to that democratization part. That's where potentially there's a lot of agency that can be imbued in actors who have the technological savvy, also to bring the digital divide. But if you can bring those things together, right, your reach is not just a megaphone, but it becomes this networked megaphone that's global. And I think that's where Twitter is very different than a lot of past communication, like the Telegraph, which was never designed to do something like that.
Is this related to what you mean by Twitter being a medium made for an event-driven society? I was curious about that. What is an event-driven society, or how does Twitter kind of factor into that phenomenon that we may be experiencing, where there's a lot of information on a whole host of events? I mean, when I read about the event-driven society, I kind of thought about that cliche of the 24-hour news cycle that's defining a lot of the ways we think about information distribution and consumption. But I was very curious to hear more about how Twitter is a medium of communication for this event-driven society.
Let me take a step back in order to, I think, better answer that question. So part of what I think drives the ways in which we interact with media and 24-hour society in general is the fact, coming from social psychology, that we've got this cognitive overload of data. Right, we constantly, 24 hours a day have, I mean, if we're awake at that time, but we have data coming in, right? We potentially, at any time we want data, we can get it. right? And you have all this stuff coming. And in a way, it sort of goes back to in my book when I talk about Twitter like a radio. You have all these channels, an infinite, from our cognitive perspective, an infinite array of data sources on Twitter or other media that are out there. So they're bombarding us potentially. Cognitively, how do we actually process that from a neuropsychological perspective? How are we actually picking out what we're going to focus our attention? And in Twitter, you've got your timeline with all your tweets that are coming in from the people you're following, and that actually can be quite a deluge of data itself. And how do you pinpoint what to actually take of interest? One, it could be the fact that people have retweeted things, right, which is most likely, or two, something just catches your fancy. Research has shown that it generally tends to be those retweets. Retweets, in a way, are reflective, if you get enough retweets, of something that constitutes an event. I'm categorizing this pretty broadly, but enough people think this thing is like an event that they're drawing attention to it, and we as social animals then start saying, okay, everyone thinks this is interesting. And in a way, in the past, news media did that in terms of creating a headline story. That was an event. What Twitter is doing is taking it with the votes of retweets. Sometimes that can be celebrity influenced or news media influenced. Often it is. But if you get people in your stream, it's like 10 other people retweeted this. We then think, okay, this is an event. Now to more broadly answer your question, I think this goes through with the fact of we have this cognitive overload. We actually crave events. We crave something to just say, hey, look at me. Right? Look at this particular event. I'm going to focus my cognitive energy on this. And some of them can smack you right in the face, you know, like Superstorm Sandy. And that was Twitter focused across it. Twitter specifically also with its trending topics tells us what the big events are as well, right? So if it's a natural disaster or with the elections, with election 2012, that was the event that the world was watching. It could be smaller events. I mean, Coney 2012 was also an event. And these things sort of draw our attention. I think Twitter, the way it's constructed in terms of hashtags and retweets, it really facilitates us going and seeing those things and saying, you know, we're very interested in the fact that Michael Jackson has died. Let's participate in that discussion. Let's look at tweets about that. So yeah, I think it's extremely event-driven. It would be hard to navigate it without it.
Another conversation that people have been having in this massive information age has to do with receiving information and participating in conversation in what I've heard called an echo chamber, or kind of a silo, right? That there's these communication silos in which people exist, where they're only talking to people who think like them or agree with them. So does Twitter keep us in our own communication silo or our own idea echo chamber, where we only communicate with people who are like us or people who think like us? Or does Twitter help to break down those barriers? You briefly touched upon this in the book in talking about how Twitter functions in networks, and you used the example of global soccer fans, that right there, that's kind of a community of tweeters that will exist around that shared commonality. But I was very curious to hear you talk about whether or not Twitter does it reinforce those echo chambers, or does it have the potential to break through them?
It's a bit of $1 million question. Actually, probably the founders of Twitter are curious exactly how that's panning out and how it will pan out. I think going back to sociology and where my discussion in the book comes from in terms of that is with the idea of homophily, right? Birds of a feather flock together. And this idea that sociology has been very intrigued by the fact that we tend to be quite homophilic. We are hesitant to go outside our comfort zone of people like us. It's always people like us. If we think the places where we live, right, we tend to look at communities where you're thinking of where to move to find people like you. And I think the same thing happens on Twitter. Even though we want to believe it's different, if you actually go through and look at the networks that Twitter tends to reinforce, A lot of research has come out showing that you get scientists, for example, tweeting together. You get music fans that are teenagers tweeting together. Right? Someone's following a particular rapper. They start going, okay, for example, Tyler, the creator, has this fan base that's all around and highly networked, and they're all very similar in terms of their very young demographic and where they're coming from. I do think exceptions arise, particularly around particular events where we cross lines. Disasters are one of those areas. With Sandy, and I'm doing some preliminary research on that, which is not in the book, but you see some of those boundaries transgressed because, for example, during Sandy, people were trying to figure out what gas stations were open in New Jersey, right? And people started tweeting with NJ Gas, so hash NJ Gas. And it wasn't, you didn't have to be from a particular social background to tweet within that. Obviously, you had to be technological savvy, which is its own stratification, but you did get crossover and people interacting who were not homophilic, but were just interested in getting gas in their car. And I think those are very interesting disjunctures and exceptions that Twitter gives to breaking the grip of homophily in a way. So it reinforces in other ways, especially with professional cultural capital, but it breaks it down sometimes when we become more human and we go back to our base needs. I don't know if gas is a base need, but it probably is for Americans.
Yeah, this is
most people.
The sections of your book, there are 4 case studies that you use in the book to illustrate these analytical interventions about Twitter and where Twitter fits sociologically and historically in modern communication. And one of the case studies that you use is on Twitter and disasters. So maybe we can speak a bit about that section of the book. Sure. You write that the ability to tweet and post YouTube videos of your, quote, disaster experience has the potential for normally marginalized individuals and groups to update the world about their situation. I thought that was just incredibly, incredibly powerful. So is this one way that social media and Twitter specifically makes the world smaller?
I think so. I think disasters are one of the very interesting cases I came across when I was researching my book and did a lot of empirical work. In the book I talk about a data set that I use regarding the Pakistan floods. Right, and what I saw in terms of the interactions of those. But going beyond the Pakistan floods, because they're not reflective really of the question you asked of citizen journalists or these micro activists or even people who are just trying to get stuff out during a disaster. I think what's phenomenally interesting is people who don't have any real clout in the world we're going through and tweeting, and we're able to get aid donations, we're able to get assistance in various ways, or just get their story out if it's just sort of autobiographical. And I think that's very interesting and does make the world potentially smaller. We, as news consumers, going back to event-driven society, when these events happen, one of the things Twitter has facilitated, though a lot of us just go through and traverse the normal media channels, we still go to the BBC, CNN, the New York Times, etc. Some people have become more adventurous during the events and are searching for the actual hashtag and event and looking at individual tweets. It's not always the normal practice, but it's happening more and more, and those things get retweeted and they get picked up. So you have cases that I saw during the Pakistan floods of individual people that were going out, actually risking their lives, taking pictures, tweeting them, and those things getting recirculated. And one of the fascinating things is some of those actually cropping up in the New York Times, CNN, the BBC. Right? These are no-name people, literally, who took the time and did that. And it kind of goes to the fact that news media outlets don't have the resources now with the recessionary environment. And it kind of dovetails into that. So if you're trying to get coverage in a remote part of Pakistan, and you have a couple of people who are very actively taking photographs and twit picking them, you are going to give them a spotlight potentially. It's not even feasible for you to get someone out in the time, because that disasters happen without any warning, most likely, and someone's out there doing that. So it's not even just an autobiographical thing and documenting your disaster experience, but you could actually be part of a larger citizen journalistic movement too. Maybe. It obviously depends if you're picked up. But
Right.
it's fascinating, and it's happening also on the flip side.
Yeah, the first case study that you do is on Twitter and journalism. So I love the term that you use, the tweeting classes and celebrity tweets and tweeting classes. Seems it's a reoccurring theme that you analyze in the book. That in some respects, Twitter enables unknown or everyday or ordinary people to participate in creating and disseminating information, and in other respects it does reinforce that certain people, certain tweets have more power than others, that maybe not all tweets are created equal. With journalism in particular, and I know you're not a journalist and you're not a scholar of journalistic ethics, but I wanted to ask, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on, do you think that problems over ethics in journalism could arise when a lot of information is coming through unregulated or unchecked tweets?
Yeah, I've done a lot of scholarship in media, and journalism has been a core part of that. And obviously working in Twitter, one has to have a real interest in journalism. There's so many journalists who are engaged in Twitter, not only as a form of dissemination of news, but also, as you're referring to, in the actual production of news. And there's been a lot of discussion in terms of involving citizen journalists. How do you do that? And the ethics of that are a phenomenally interesting question. And initially, for the people who were adopting information from Twitter, there wasn't much of an understanding in terms of vetting that information. It's like, how do you deal with these people? Many of them have these funny usernames, and you can't actually validate things. We've seen over time that when I first started doing research for the book, there were so few news agencies that were really embracing Twitter. And then when I was finishing up the book, you have a complete turn where you get all these quotes from people running news organizations saying, well, if you're not on social media, if you're not engaging social media effectively, you are literally going to be yesterday's news, right? You have to be doing this. So I think the actual industry itself has had to step up in terms of creating codes of practice. Not that all of them have been institutionalized. There's been some moves for institutionalization, but there definitely are emergent ethics that are coming through. That's not to say there's plenty of times that it's not working. I mean, one big ethical quandary is, should you pay the people who've taken those photographs and tweeted them? It's a big, big debate. It's a big ethical question, because on the one hand, these people published it into the public domain. So newspapers are saying, well, we can just include that stuff. Some of them don't even actually give credit to the original tweeter, but many are saying, okay, image courtesy of @mentioned blah, or they'll actually ask the Twitter user. So there's phenomenally interesting things on the ethical point of view of using information content that's actually owned by those people. But it's another ethical question about how to actually validate some of that information. And there's been plenty of cases where journalists themselves have passed on information from Twitter which was incorrect, and we saw some of that during the election, for example, where misinformation was propagated by journalists too. So it's a funny one, I think, because of the speed of it. Right. It's hard to fact check quickly, because journalists are also retweeting and forwarding stuff on Twitter, and they haven't necessarily applied the same rigor when they're circulating that, but at the same time they're still reporting. They're still journalists. So it's a kind of funny journalistic space, Twitter.
I was interested in a hypothetical question about what it would look like to compare and contrast tweets or Twitter data from around the world with respects to disasters. So in the West, or in the United States and Western Europe, or what a lot of people, the 21st century at least, what we would call the developed world. You know, there's this breakdown of the world into parts. Parts are developing, or parts are underdeveloped, and I see correlation to a kind of Cold War division of the world into the first world and the third world. But with disasters, just in recent history, we see disasters seem to affect all parts of the world: the developed world, the developing world, the undeveloped world, and Twitter exists in all parts of the world. So I was just really curious if you could hypothesize or speculate a bit about what might it look like to compare and contrast tweets on disasters in these globally disparate and even kind of economically and politically disparate parts of the world. And they're all areas where where someone like you could extrapolate data on disaster tweets.
Yeah, and from my vantage point, because I haven't actually done the work, it is purely hypothetical. I mean, I'll be happy to comment on what I see, some of its implications. I think disaster researchers, and I'm involved with that community actively, are very interested in exactly that question, because analysis has been done on a lot of different global disasters, and even taking into account different languages, right? So you're searching for those keywords in local languages. And a lot has been done, for example, in timing. So how quickly after an earthquake, that's been a big genre because meteorological seismic reporting is very standardized in a lot of data gathering settings. So you can get data from different countries, and it's in exactly the same format that you need to standardize that. So the disaster community has then disaster research community has taken that and compared that to the speed in which you find out about a disaster on Twitter. So it just happened to be a random, aftershock or earthquake or whatever, and not completely predictable. And it tends to show that within 5 seconds you get the first tweets globally, right? And that is correlated with being faster in countries which have a higher Twitter penetration and more technological adoption. So in Japan, that number is sometimes a second, 2 seconds. Literally, as the first tremors come, people in Japan, and they get a lot of earthquakes. Earthquake. One-word tweets that come through, right, in Japanese, and then in English within like a minute, even in Japan or so. So frequency has been a big thing that's been analyzed. And as you can imagine, from a data perspective, that's the easiest. What hasn't been done so far is looking at the real content of those tweets, right? Like really trying to, people have done some initial work on certain disasters, for example, on wildfires. There's been a group of researchers who have studied those and actually coded different types of tweets, which ones were informational from actually on-the-ground citizen journalists, which ones were passing along information from news media, which ones were this, which ones were that. But there hasn't been a sort of global effort to do that across a certain genre of disaster. I hope that does occur because I think it would be very interesting to see the differences. Hypothetically, I think what will probably emerge, this goes back to your question about digital divides, is those of us who tweeting has become so embedded to us, and especially you look at things like the iPhone 5, sending a tweet is so easy now. It's just embedded into the infrastructure of the phone itself. It's like sending an email. It's like turning the thing on. You can tweet it, right? So countries where these technologies have become so ubiquitous, I think we'll see different reportage that exists during the disasters that may be more like, this is my disaster experience, and may be so content rich that governments will actually be able to discern a phenomenal amount of information from them. Like in Superstorm Sandy, we have Americans who took the time to take so many photographs that news media were not only using this, but other people were saying, okay, I shouldn't go there. That's probably a bad area to go to because there was such rich photo information. And I would hypothetically say in a lot of developing countries that you're going to have pockets of that. There's going to be certain people that have that technology and that are within that social practice, right? It's become naturalized for them, but it's not going to be so widespread in terms of pervasiveness. So I'd be interested to see, as research develops, not only the frequency difference, but actually what the richness of content that emerges in terms of tweets.
Along these lines, the chapter on activism, again, really fascinating. I enjoyed reading a lot of the book. I don't want to say that was my favorite chapter, but it was a chapter.
You like.
Well, the disasters chapter and the activism chapter, I just found that you gave a really clear and interesting analysis to contemporary phenomena. I mean, things that are happening that we are trying to make sense of, and then by you explaining what Twitter does in these events and in these phenomena as they happen was just really exciting to read. And with the chapter on activism, I want to throw the question back at you, which you address or mention at least in the chapter, Malcolm Gladwell's kind of succinct, almost rhetorical question, right? Are revolutions tweeted, right? Which you, I think, accurately say is a bit of a straw argument. But I wanted to just raise it with you. Are revolutions tweeted? Or probably better way to ask it is the way that you phrase it. Can a tweet or a group of tweets bring feet to the streets, right? So what is the role that Twitter plays in these decentralized, seemingly sporadic gatherings of people calling for political change, whether it's in Tahrir Square or Zuccotti Park and Occupy Wall Street? Like, Twitter is a part of political movements in the 21st century, in the Twitter age. So, what is your answer to this question that Gladwell raises of are revolutions tweeted?
First, I need to do the tweets, feats to the street into a really cool rap or hip-hop routine.
Yeah, that one's good. That was good. Can a group of tweets bring feet to the street? That was really good.
There is a song that needs to be attached to my book at some point. Find the right rapper for that. Anyways, on a more serious note, I think the question is an extremely complex one. And I do think Gladwell's argument is definitely a bit of a straw man in that sense, because everything is tweeted, right? And that's the sort of larger argument I was getting in certain contexts. I mean, we're talking about Tahrir, we're talking about Zuccotti Park. There's certain aspects of society in the Twittering classes, as I've sort of referred to in the book, which are becoming larger and larger. Right, and contra what I said about digital, well, not contra what I said, but to give more clarity what I said about digital divides, one of the interesting things is, and this is specific to data in the US, I'm slowly moving more international in terms of gathering the data, but in the US, there is an extremely high rate of adoption by people of color of Twitter, especially of African Americans. Way, way higher, right? And there's a markedly higher increase with Latino populations as well. The Pew research project on internet has done a lot of work on that and showed that, and actually the empirical data that I've done with my Twitter data set validates that. So we can't just actually sit back and say, okay, it's these really privileged bourgeois elite that are twittering. One of the interesting things about Twitter is there's a phenomenally high correlation that's been shown in sociological literature between people who are interested in entertainment news and Twitter use, which is partially why we have that significance amongst African American populations who historically have been very interested in entertainment news, right? And also people of color in America have been very interested in that. So sort of going back to your point in a long-winded way, tweeting is very pervasive.
Right.
So to say the revolution will be tweeted is a bit of course it will. Right. But to say tweets caused the revolution is a very different argument. And that's where I think it's very difficult to say, okay, 140 characters, that's actually going to bring feet to the street. That's a really tall order in and of itself, right? That being said, you get enough of a cascade of people tweeting amongst themselves in these networks that has the potential. It doesn't happen often, but we did see in Occupy Wall Street, for example, more than even Tahrir, because Occupy Wall Street's existing in a space where we don't have complete police repression. And you don't have to fear for your life if you look at some tweets and then say, you know what, I'm going to go attend that march. And a lot of people actually with Occupy Wall Street saw tweets that said, come to this march, we're going to be at this block at this time. And they went there and they actually took part. Or they went to a particular protest or speech or something else. And I think that's tremendously powerful in that way of bringing feet to the street. I think the distinction I make in that chapter is low risk versus high risk. Right. And I think in the fact of Tahrir, you had people who are really risking their lives, and you had some people where tweets did bring their feet to the street. But it wasn't so much as in a low risk situation where you say, you know what, come to this park at this time, you're not going to have to worry about being gassed or shot. But this is an important cause. Be there, right? And Kony 2012 really leveraged that when they went around and put Kony 2012 stickers all through the night on a particular day all throughout the world. It didn't take that much effort for you to go and put up a sticker. I'm not saying that the cause was good or bad, but in terms of the level of stakes, it was low. Right. So I think what Twitter is particularly good at is if there's something that doesn't take a lot of effort in terms of activism, you can get a lot of people mobilized. And that may be democratic, right? You get all, the sort of reference I make in the book is towards latte activism or slacktivism. So you're sipping your mochaccino and you decide to retweet or sign a White House petition or post on this blog or whatever to do your activist thought. So I think the same with bringing feet to the street. It can't be too much of a high stake effort, or people don't necessarily come from 140 characters. Right.
And you talk in this chapter about strong ties, right? So I thought that sociological analysis, or the connection between the technology and its social embeddedness, with where this technology is kind of planting its roots, that's, for me, was a very important part of your analysis of activism and Twitter. That strong ties will exist or won't exist depending on the social context. But what I wanted to ask you to elaborate on a bit is, how might Twitter help to reinforce strong ties amongst people, and even people who are in a high-risk place? So it's not Twitter that's bringing them out to risk their lives, but they're doing it anyway, and Twitter is playing a role in that. It's playing a communication role.
Absolutely, and I think that's a very fascinating question in the sense that Twitter, one thing I should clarify here, Twitter is not replacing older styles of activism where you have people, in a basement or some room and they're strategizing. And in my book, I talk about looking at civil rights movements in the US and the fact that you had people in college campuses, right, who are very close together and tight, who are strong, tight networks, roommates or family members or close friends who they're bringing in and basically saying, we've got to do a sit-in, or we've got to, get on this bus at the same time, we've got to go into the store at this point, or whatever. Not only is it high stakes, but they obviously have a strong tie network. How are those strong ties reinforced, and how do you get people into that network? It's very close-knit, and you have to keep meeting, and you have to keep saying, okay, we're going to do these things, and you keep having these events. Now, one of the interesting things about Twitter in terms of reinforcing strong tie relationships is, so you have these strong tie relationships in terms of an activist network, and on Twitter, you could be discussing anything. And that's reinforcing your strong tie relationship, just like you were doing in the room. But you don't have to be in the room. In fact, you could tweet about what you had for breakfast. And that is reinforcing your strong tie relationship because it makes you feel more present in that person's life, which is a larger argument of Twitter and social media generally. Why do we tweet, right? Why do we have this compulsion to update people about what we're doing? Why do we tweet about breakfast? Why do we tweet that we're late to catch the bus or whatever? It's because we're social and we want to be engaged. And that's, I think, I think that's missed a lot in activist movements, is people have to trust each other when they're putting so much at risk, where they're buying into a big cause. And one of the interesting things you see about tweets between activists is it's not just about strategizing about the activist movements, but they bond. And when they bring in new people as well, they're also tweeting together. Some of the secret stuff is actually done in secret because they don't want people to see that. They do that by email, etc. But there's a lot of stuff actually going on to build that network, to keep it strong, and to keep it very vibrant. And I think the technology is quite fascinating in that way of making them feel they're in the same location, the same place. And it could even be dangerous for them to be physically in the same location, right? In some movements, people are going to be tracking them. So if they do it on Twitter and they use anonymous usernames, in a way they can be very, very social, very gregarious, and it can be amazing for networks in that way.
I found that the chapter on health, Twitter and health, it had similar themes that you explored as in the disaster chapter, in the activism chapter, in the journalism chapter, but I kind of found the health chapter to be the most poignant one, and maybe even a little bit it seemed very personal. It goes to what you said. I'm picking up of what you just said about tweeting being very social.
Right.
It's in that chapter on Twitter and health where you analyze a bit more clearly a shifting or a blurring of public and private. Again, that's a theme that's throughout the book. But in the chapter on tweets and health, I found that you had a more focused conversation about Twitter, about tweeting and Twitter blurring those public-private boundaries. So how did analysis of tweets and Twitter use around health issues help you to make that argument and make that analysis?
I think you're absolutely right in saying that a large component of that chapter, as well as tying into a larger thematic of the book, is about the blurring between public and private. When I spoke with people and when I've discussed the book, for example, in my social media class, people were absolutely shocked about how much people are sharing on Twitter about their health. Right? And if we think backwards in time, there's historical hints at this trend changing over time. Right? We have, for example, with radio phone-in shows about health. Right? This is old technology. People would call it, I mean, if you think about Fraser Crane and our psychological well-being, people going into these big, long, flowing things, or writing in letters into a magazine saying, I've got this health problem, right? And they could be deeply personal. It could be some sexual issue that people feel ashamed to talk about, and then they talk about it in a magazine, sometimes not even anonymous. So we have these media antecedents. But what's, in a way, perceived, and I think you're saying it feels the most personal, what many people almost label as crazy, that people, one of the first things before they pick up the phone and even call their parents, they're on their phone tweeting from a doctor's office saying, just got diagnosed with cancer, right? I found out I have 2 months to live. Or deeply, deeply personal information that's going out in not even 140 characters, but like 60 or 70 characters. And the boundary between public and private there is no boundary, right? This is the most deeply personal and intimate information being shared. And it took me a long time to think through why, from a sociological perspective, this was happening, because not only, as we talked about the megaphone, right? Not only is it just going to your circle of friends like in Facebook, but you get this megaphone and it's also networked public, so this information is disseminating. And you see instances when you look at the data that you have random strangers that actually are tweeting back to these people saying, hang in there, you know, I'm also been diagnosed with breast cancer a week ago or something, and these people don't know each other. So one of the things I was trying to understand is, are people tweeting because they want these strangers to respond to them? Are they tweeting because it's a really efficient way to inform all their friends that this happened to them and they're looking for their friends to respond? And I sort of thought, well, why didn't they do that on Facebook? Why are they doing it on Twitter? Because people have been doing that on Facebook. And I also thought, well, is it a form of almost telling your diary, right? So people throughout time, when they've had a big event happen to them, they open their diary, obviously not in their doctor's office, it just happens our phones are with us, and they start expressing their thoughts. It's kind of all of those things together, obviously not the Facebook component, but we want to inform our friends. We're looking to affirm that this thing is happening to us, the event, right? It's an event. It's a big event to us, so we publish it. And if someone happens to respond, they respond. It's not why we do it per se exclusively. And we're also, interested in documenting those things. It can help us. And then we could start tweeting other things like I can't feel like I can't even get in my car now and drive home, or I'm just going to start crying now, or whatever. And you see these deeply personal tweets. So on the one hand, you have people who then get supported by other people via Twitter, and you have other people who Twitter becomes a diary. It becomes cathartic for them to talk about their health. But it's definitely some of the most personal tweets that I've seen that completely blur those boundaries. And as opposed to previous technologies and media, the level of intimacy people share is quite profound, actually, in terms of their health.
So I have 3 questions as means of conclusion. The first one is it's a little bit glib, but with Twitter, are we saying more with less? Or are we just saying less? I think that's one of the ways that you introduce kind of social questions about Twitter. But I wanted to ask you what your thought is on that. Well, I think it's a bit of a glib question.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, it's an interesting one. If rather than answer it, in a way, it's a conversation or conversational opener of conclusions. Mm-hmm. In the sense that it's neither one nor the other. In a way that the ways in which we tweet are so different. If we think about tweeting during a disaster versus tweeting about health versus tweeting about our breakfast or lunch, or tweeting that we need to get a new pair of shoes, there are so many different contexts. If you think about the ways in which we communicate, going back to Erving Goffman, we always are self-presenting. Right? That's just a part that all communication is, social communication. But we have going back to Goffman, different stages we perform on, right? So some of those stages are quite formal in a job interview, some of those stages are quite informal when you're with friends. And some of those, going back to the comment about fire, don't require much communication. Mm-hmm. One thing is for sure, and this varies by demographic, is that some people are sharing a lot more now via social media than they would otherwise. One of the larger arguments, we didn't really talk about this, but in a way this is a good question to seg into it, is some of the critics whom you talked about at the beginning of this talk have kind of lambasted Twitter, saying it's reducing our face-to-face time. Mm-hmm. And then others have shot back and said, actually, Twitter is helping us interact with people because it's informing us on elements about those people's lives. So maybe we're talking about a larger breadth of topics with less, with the 140 characters, right? We keep just blasting out more information, but it's small. So you say, oh, this happened to my kid, or my car's broken, I need a new set of tires, or whatever it is, right? Or on the flip side, in some contexts, maybe we're not tweeting that much, and we have something that's really bothering us. We're having a dark day, and we need a Twitter hug or twug. So you go through that way. So I think there's an interesting tension between saying less, saying more. How do these things percolate together? But yeah, I've kind of dodged the question in a way, but that is ultimately what I feel about Twitter. That it's hard to reduce it down because there's so many contexts of social communication. It's a communications medium, but it has to take the traffic of all these different types of contexts, and it's too hard for me to reduce.
Right. I think that's the benefit of the book, is that it moves our focus and our question away from just the rather. I don't want to be reductive, but it moves us.
Bad word today.
Well, it moves. Your book and your analysis, it moves us away from the communication medium as the focus of our attention, and it moves us on the social context in which the communication medium exists. And whether we're talking about Twitter or we're talking about, which I didn't get to ask you about, but it was one of my favorite things in the book. The notificator, whether we're talking about email or telegraphs, right? It's the way that people use them that you're arguing is important and interesting, and that's where we should start our analysis. Two more questions. I thought it was interesting at the end of the book you mentioned that the Library of Congress is archiving tweets. So again, hypothetically speaking, or if you could imagine when future historians are doing research on the early 21st century and they're sifting through these, well, now I'm imagining that they're sifting through paper. I don't know what it will look like, but when historians use tweets as evidence on the 21st century, what type of world do you think that they'll find in these tweets? Or
yeah, I think it was extremely fascinating when Twitter announced they were giving the data to the Library of Congress. When Twitter first came out, a group of sociologists who sort of saw Twitter as this way to go back to mass observation studies, which were a big part of sociology. If you think of 20th century sociology, there were a lot of movements that were very important to sociology of looking at masses of people. And if you think a lot of sociologists who were involved in those mass observation movements would go around with clipboards and just randomly go up to people. It's like a vox pop interview and say, oh, what do you think about this? What do you think about this, about some particular event? And you also watch people, so you've got an ethnographic observation, especially of localized events. Initially, sociologists, when they saw Twitter, thought, okay, we can do this on Twitter. We just collect all these gobs of data and we can look at a mass of people. Obviously, what they found is similar to what I found in my book, that you can't do that. Obviously, people are presenting in very specific contexts. They've all got different motives of why they're tweeting. You can't actually have the same environment in a sense. Just because they're all tweeting, it doesn't mean you can take all this data and compare it. And to go to your question, in a way, what's quite interesting about Twitter observation data, etc., is its role it's going to play in the future to historians. Not being a historian, you are, but I'm wildly curious. Actually, historians have made a living going back to people's diaries, letters that people have written to each other, etc. And social historians have gone back, looked at newspaper articles, looked at minutes from like club meetings and societies, combined that with all sorts of data that they have. And I'm quite curious, this goes back to the hypothetical part, but there is a phenomenal amount of interesting data that emerges in Twitter. Obviously, you've got to sift through it, but especially around events. If a historian is looking to, let's say a historian wants to look at the death of Michael Jackson, right, and is looking at data on Twitter, getting all these very diverse perspectives. And now we have with Twitter also geolocation, so you can tell where a lot of tweets are actually physically located. How do you start reading these tweets as historical text? In a way, it's a question for you.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think there's a tremendous amount of significance in the data, not because it's Twitter, but because there's a ton of social communication that's being archived, which isn't directly labeled in terms of its significance. We actually have to do the heavy lifting in terms of making sense and being critically analytical of the actual things that have been propagated and discussed. But I think it's fascinating.
So that's going to be an issue that, a future generation of historians, methods classes will have to deal with.
I think so, which is why I have no problem writing a book about Twitter. Often people have said, "Oh, is your book already obsolete?" I've said, "No, actually, if Twitter went away, it would not take away this enormous amount of data that's been collected and will be left for us to reflect on. So if it ended today, we've got terabytes and terabytes of data which people can go back and say, hey, let's look at this event, let's look at this. What did people do during Occupy Wall Street, or this event, or that event, or something minor? Yeah. Right? How are people responding to breast cancer diagnoses? There's just a lot of data there.
And my last question, I'll use the book as a prop for it. I think it's
you get the exact page count.
Close to that's right. Well, 8 chapters, that's what I wanted to get. 8 chapters, well over 175 pages with references and whatnot. And what I'm going to ask you to do is unfair. but can you summarize this wonderful book in 140 characters? Can you give me a tweet on your book?
I'll do it even shorter. I think, therefore I tweet.
Right.
Even though the book is not reductively Cartesian by any stretch of the imagination with a 140 character challenge, that's it. Or I'm social, therefore I tweet.
I'm social, therefore I tweet.
Probably an even better response, right? It's all about social communication, so in that way I'll rescind the other one. I'm
social, therefore I tweet.
Yeah, it's our social engagement with other people. We find it as a way to outreach and hook in and to update people. It's one of the larger thematics that I'm trying to get across in terms of update cultures, that a lot of Twitter is about updating people about what we're doing.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you, Don.